Well, this video is the one that you've been waiting for because we're actually going to start to build the footstool. But before we do, I want to direct your attention to the drawings that are part of the course material. If you haven't downloaded and printed this out yet, then do so. You're going to want to have something like this on hand. It's a simple project. You can probably remember the lengths of the parts and everything, but it's still a good habit to get into to have your drawing here, and it'll take any guesswork out of things. So these two boards here, do you remember those? Those were the ones that I cut in half in that imaginary Home Depot parking lot a few videos ago. Now the wood's in here, and we have other decisions to make as far as cutting our parts go. I should have mentioned in that Home Depot parking lot cutting video that some lumber outlets will cut for you. So you might want to check that. You don't necessarily have to go equipped with a saw and a tape measure to the store if you can pay a few dollars and have them do some rough cuts for you. Do not rely on them to do fine cuts though, because the chances are excellent that they're not going to get the lengths right. So it's just a rough cutting proposition. And also, just be aware that even if a store has a cut for the customer policy, there may be 4 or 5 people in front of you waiting to have their lumber across, rough cut too. So it could take you some time. Different stores might charge you for the privilege of cutting that wood, and maybe you don't want to pay a few dollars a cut or something like that. So anyway, back to this now. We have 2 pieces of wood here. We have more than enough wood to make our stool. Now in the course material, I explained that what you need to do is go to a lumber yard and buy an 8-foot long construction grade 2x10. But that's not what we have here. And there's a kind of a story behind that. I went to the lumber yard. I'd like an 8-foot long 2x10. I needed some wood to make this video. Oh, looking on the computer, sorry, we don't have any 8-footers. I can sell you a 10-footer. The reason I mention that is because that is not unusual. When you go to actually buy wood, you need to be fairly flexible of mind. You might have optimized your shopping list based on the assumption that a certain length of lumber was available, and you get there and you find that it's not. So that's what happened here. This actually was a 10-footer that I cut in half. That's fine. We'll use the wood for other purposes. But right now, what I want to show you is how I examine these boards to get the best possible part out of the best possible part of the board. Not all of the boards need to be as perfectly flat and true as others. It matters more for some parts than the others. And what I'm going to show you now is the thinking process that I use to go in to get the best possible part out of a given chunk of board. Because depending on the decision you make, you can get parts that are quite a bit better than the same parts if they were broken out of the board in different ways. So that's what we're going to do right now. Now I would consider these boards to be fairly wide. And when a board gets wide, sometimes it's actually quite common for it to form a kind of a cup shape. So if you look here, look at that. That's quite extreme. And of course, same thing on the other side, except it's concave. It's less so at this end. Let me take a look at this other board. Similar, a little bit less at that end. So why am I looking at this? Well, for the simple reason that some of the parts can handle cuppedness easier than others. I mean, for instance, out of all of these pieces of wood, I want the flattest and the nicest to be the top. Because if there's a cup shape here in the bottom, we're going to be able to see that on the side. I expect we're not going to be able to avoid that completely. Now, to be sure, the screws can pull this down flat to a certain extent, but this is fairly thick wood. I don't think the screw is going to be able to pull it all the way down. Now, in more advanced woodworking, there are techniques for dealing with this cupped shape or any irregularity in the wood. There are ways of dealing with it, but those are all moderate or advanced tactics. We're just keeping things simple for now. Looking at it, the plans here again, I think the cross piece is most likely to be able to handle some cuppedness properly, because any cuppedness is just going to be a curve here, but it's still going to be a tight joint to the leg. So what I'm going to do now is look at my boards and see where I can get the best possible piece to form the top. And if you look here, the top's 20 inches long. So now we are going to be cutting this to final length, unlike the last time we did some sawing, which was just rough cutting. So let me snoop around, and I'm going to find the best possible area for the top, and then we're actually going to cut it. So I've examined my boards, and if you remember, I did tentatively assign certain areas of the boards to different parts, like cross, that's a cross piece, top here. I think those decisions that I made for that previous video, cutting outside, are good ones. So we're going to proceed now to actually cut the cross piece and cut the top. But if you remember, these lines, they're not the final lines that denote the part lengths. These were lines that I drew on here to help me decide where I was going to make that one cut, that one rough cut, to make the board short enough to go into the car. So I'm not going to pay attention to these anymore, and eventually they'll be sanded off and you won't see them. So let's just take a look at something. This was a cut that I made with the handsaw. Maybe it's square enough for us to consider it as a finished cut. Let's see. It's a little bit out of square on that direction. Let's see. But you know, this is another bit of a lesson you need to learn. Is this absolutely perfectly square all the way along? Well, not exactly. There's a little bit of a gap here, and it's tight here. But you need to understand that there's such a thing as absolute perfection and real-world perfection. And real-world perfection would be something that's good enough to do the job, but it goes beyond good enough. It's good enough to the point where, to a casual observer, it's going to look perfect. So that's what I call functionally perfect. You know, if you're a particular person, if you're really into details and things, and I suspect many of you are, it's very easy to overdo the perfectionist thing. And you'll end up taking a whole lot longer than you should, but most importantly, you will get discouraged if you try to make things too perfect. In other words, absolute perfection, ultimate perfection. You'll never get that. You want functional perfection. And this end here, it's functionally perfect. So we're going to take this as an actual end. And let's see, what is this? This is the cross piece. So referring to the plan, I see that the cross piece is 16 inches long. So that's what I'm going to do now. I'm going to mark that 16 inches, and I'm going to cut it. So 16 inches here. You may wonder, why is that red? Why is that red, and why does that have a special symbol? Well, most tape measures have a red mark every 16 inches. You can see the next one's here is 32, the next one will be 48, and that's because in house framing, the center of the studs are often 16 inches apart. So it doesn't really affect you now, but just a bit of a knowledge tangent there, so you understand the funny markings on your tape measure. We don't need to go crazy with our marks, just as long as we can see them. And oh, one other thing. Earlier in the course, I talked about wood moisture and how you should be buying kiln-dried construction-grade lumber for this. The moisture content is probably going to be closer to ideal, but most importantly, the lumber has not sat in a pile while it was wet growing mold. Most non-kiln dried lumber looks like that, and you can't get the staining out. It looks bad. Doesn't matter because this stuff is meant for house frames, but when you're dealing with a woodworking project like this, it does matter. And look here, different grade stamps have different designations, but look at this one here. You see that the KD there? That stands for kiln dried. So in the case of construction lumber, that means it's drier than 20% moisture content when it came out of the mill. And HT, that stands for heat treated, which means like kiln drying does involve heat on the wood. Heat to a certain level, but heat treating is even hotter. And the reason for heat treating is to kill any insects or eggs or larvae that might be in the wood, just to make sure it's kind of not going to transmit any tree diseases that way. And just so you know too, SPF, that stands for spruce, pine, or fir. Where I live, a construction grade board could be either of those, either of these three, or one of these three. It doesn't matter which one for construction grade use, and it doesn't really matter for small projects either, but that's just what it means. It could be either of those three species. Our first part, cross piece. Now I'm going to mark and cut out the piece for the top. So 20 inches for the top. So 20 inches here. Now, I'm paying attention to something. There aren't any knots along the cut line. If there were knots along the cut line, I'd have to shift the piece over because I definitely do not want knots on the cut line because they can fall out. They make for hard cutting and they don't look that good. So I've got my cut started, my hand is away, I'm looking at the reflection of this part of the wood in the saw and I want it to appear continuous. And I'm also cutting on the waste side of the line, so that's that side of the line. So this is scrap. This isn't going to be part of our stool. And if you remember, there was some cracks here. We wanted to stay away from those. We also wanted to stay away from this damage here. But this piece of wood is still large enough to keep, at least for a while. You never know when you're going to need a small piece for another project. So now it's the two legs, and you can see the plans here show them at 14.5 inches long. So we will make our mark, 14.5. Let's just double check that cut, nice and square, so we can use it for our next one, 14.5. Good. So we've got our four pieces right now, and at this stage, I want to introduce you to another way of thinking, because there's something we need to do before we proceed with actually putting this stool together. One of the things you need to keep in mind as you're building projects is that plans like this are not necessarily chiseled in stone. And by that, I mean you should be ready, willing, and able to modify a design as you go along. Now, many of the things that I build are not built from plans made by someone else. I usually come up with my own designs, and it's not unusual for me to be building these things for the first time after having imagined what they're like. So at this stage, what I want you to do is to just stop and look and see how things are going. Now, I've kind of temporarily assembled this footstool, but in real life, this would be up here, of course. Right? But because I'm just dry fitting it together, it's got to sit at the bottom. So don't pay too much attention to that. But, you know, I'm looking at this thing, and I'm thinking two things. Let's see here. The first thing I'm thinking is, it's too tall. It's too tall for its width. It should be a little bit shorter. I mean, it's still going to work, but doesn't it seem a little top heavy to you? You can use your eye. You can make your own judgments on this, but I think I'm going to reduce the length of these legs while I have the chance. Another thing that kind of bothers me a bit about the design, I think the overhang here is just barely enough, aesthetically speaking. That's mostly what I'm talking about now, is how does it look? Your work as a woodworker is not just about the practical techniques of cutting and joining lumber. It's also about your eye and developing a sense of what looks right and proportional and what does not. But looking at this right now, I think I'm going to cut those legs down, make them a bit shorter. Let's try 2 inches. Oh, a little bit more actually, 2.5 inches. I'm going to cut off 2.5 inches. I think that's going to be fine. If I'm wrong, then I guess we can cut another couple of legs, but I don't think I'm going to be wrong. So I'm just going to mark and cut. You have to be not afraid to take in what you're seeing as a project is growing and making shifts sometimes. It's not really a very big deal with a footstool like this, but sometimes the ability to pivot and to adjust your design and your approach midway, a very powerful technique. And it can help you to achieve better things. Because when you're imagining a project, your imagination is limited. And sometimes there's nothing quite like seeing and making a decision based on that. So I'm going to cut those legs shorter, and then we'll try the dry fit again and see what it looks like. So I've shortened the legs. I think it looks better. Don't you? Now don't forget, the cross piece is going to be up top. It's going to be up high. It's just sitting there now to give us the spacing. But I like that a lot better. I'm going to go with that. So what do you think? Should we shorten the cross piece to gain a little more overhang? We could, but I kind of like it that way. And the fact that it's shorter now makes the overhang seem a little longer than it did to my eye. Let me show you something. I didn't actually use the handsaw to shorten these legs. I used what's called a chop saw, and I want to take you over to take a look at it now. But you know, remember I mentioned how power tools are noisy and dusty, and they do cost money too, and you need space to accommodate them. But their advantage is higher quality results that require less skill. So this cut here was done with the handsaw. That's about as clean as a handsaw cut can get with that type of general purpose handsaw. And it's not bad. We will refine that later, and I'll show you how to do that. But take a look at this. This was the cut with the chop saw. Look at how smooth that is. Very nice and smooth. And it took a lot less skill too. I didn't have to mark with a square. I didn't have to have my hand-eye coordination developed, so I just skirting on the waist side of the line. All I needed was this one mark right here, one little mark, and then I went over to the chop saw. So let me take you over there. Like I said, this is a teaching tangent now. I'm kicking into a teaching tangent. This is not what you need. It's not what you should have right now as a beginner, but it's out there, so you can see what's available. So let's pop over. I will make a sample cut so you can just see how a chop saw works. So this is my stationary chop saw. I don't take it anywhere. It's built into this, this cabinet that actually sucks the bulk of the dust down. And the sides are outfeed tables. So if I have a longer piece, it's fully supported. You don't have to worry about any of that. But there's the blade. Pull this trigger here and it starts spinning. But in addition to making really nice smooth cross cuts, all chop saws can be rotated for different angles. So it's really quite luxurious here, and you know the angles are denoted here. This particular saw can also tilt this way. So this is called a miter adjustment here, and then when the saw tilts in this way or this way, that's called a bevel adjustment. So all very advanced stuff. Don't want to bore you with it, but I'm just going to make a cut so you can see how fast it is and how noisy it is too. You can see why people use saws like this. Nice and smooth. I mean, that is perfectly crisp edge. Almost finish ready, really, even for fine furniture. So coming up next, I'm going to show you how to assemble this. There are a few things we need to do before we get to that stage, and I'll show you those. Chances are excellent that your cuts aren't all that great. You may have messed up badly on one of the cuts. Now, I should say the cuts that matter are the ones here and here, because those are the ends that you're going to see. Less important are these cuts, and especially the ones at the bottom. So maybe you can flip a leg over and put your bad cut where it won't be seen, or if worse comes to worst, you can always cut another piece. Or maybe before you even start to cut your good pieces, maybe you want to make some practice cuts too, you know, just over and over. There's nothing like repetition to learn how to do something, and there's in fact no substitute for a lot of repetition when it comes to the hand-eye coordination thing. So if you have messed up a part, don't beat yourself up about it. It's kind of like your tuition fees in a sense to mess up some wood. And the nice thing about this construction grade lumber is it's the cheapest wood around. If I messed up the top and I had to do it again, I'm just looking at a couple of dollars worth of wood. And I don't even necessarily need to get rid of that piece. I just put it in my scrap area and I might use it for some other part again. So be gentle with yourself, expect to make mistakes, and then just work towards correcting them.